the slowest economic recovery ever. We can't even get to an average. I mean, an average is a C grade. We should be able at least to get a C grade, and when wages are flat and household incomes are flat, people are taking notice. And I think the numbers that began, Mr. Holtz-Eakin, you started out with saying the standard of living that Americans have enjoyed and appreciated, normally that's doubling every 32 years or so, and now it's going to double every 90 years. So you've added 60 years under the standard of living for an American family. And it's probably no surprise then that a lot of folks in our country think this is the new normal. I think the public's accepting it. Unfortunately, many elected officials are accepting it, and we can do a lot better. And when you see that 72% of Americans just a few weeks ago think the economy is still in recession, when we've been out of recession for 5.5 years, actually, is pretty alarming. But I think what's most troubling is that two-thirds of Americans, if you ask them, are your children going to be better off than you are? Two-thirds of Americans say no. I mean, they don't see a bright horizon, and we know that the policies we have an opportunity to have an impact on in the new Congress now can make a difference in tax policy, fixing a broken tax code. We talked about that. Trade policy, knowing 750,000 jobs in my state of Minnesota are tied to trade. We've got huge opportunities with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with the European Trade Agreement. Obviously, getting Trade Promotion Authority is key to that, though, if we're going to get the best deal on the table. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But also, I want to talk about regulation. Maybe, Mr. Holtz-Eakin, you can just mention real quick, is it possible to measure how much expansion of regulations in recent years are costing our workers, is costing the economy in slower growth, and if so, how much, if you can measure that?
Well, thank you for the question. As I hope you know, at the American Action Forum, we have an ongoing attempt to measure the regulatory burden in the United States, where what's called the Regulation Rodeo Database tracks all regulations coming out of every agency in the Federal Government and looks at a couple of different measures of their burden, all of which are incomplete, but it gives you some sense. First is the self-reported compliance costs. Agencies say how much will this cost to comply with, and we can total up those compliance costs. There's the paperwork burden, how many hours, and in my written testimony, there's some measure of the paperwork burden hours from different regulations in the Affordable Care Act, for example. You can look at that comprehensively. And I'd be happy to get you the totals, but if you look at 2014, for example, final regulation added just in terms of compliance costs about $20 billion in 2014 alone. If you think about doing that every year, that's a $200 billion tax increase. And if this committee was debating a $200 billion tax increase, we'd have a strong discussion about whether it was economically desirable, what would be the growth impacts, how did we want to think about that. That debate doesn't go on the regulatory front. And I think if you look back over the past 6 years, it has been an extraordinary period for regulation, and these costs display that. The only comparable period in my recent memory was post-September 11, 2001, when the Bush administration did a lot of national security anti-terrorism regulation, which was comparably costly. These are big impacts on the economy, and I think they merit consideration. I'd be happy to get you the numbers.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I know we'll be looking at that in the coming months. Let me ask one other question, because I know in the 1990s, I understand that we were successful as a country in boosting the labor force participation rate, increasing take-home pay, and reducing poverty, all which has gone the opposite direction right now in these last 6 years, currently, through welfare reforms. Could another round of welfare reform do the same? Could it improve those numbers? Can we do more on welfare reform? Should we be looking at that, and what are some ideas? Mr. Holtz-Eakin, yeah.
As I said, I think we need to look at the work incentives. The 1990s have lessons for the U.S. and also some things that are different. The economy grew, and there's no substitute for rapid economic growth, and improving the long-term growth rate of this economy is, I think, the #1 priority. That makes the welfare reform of the 90s easier to both enact and for its participants to be successful. So you want it in that kind of an environment. I think we should try to do that again. I don't think you want to replicate the dot-com bubble, which led to an enormous inflow of revenues, made it easier to balance the budget. You want to do it the old-fashioned way, not rely on a bubble that then breaks in 2001. And the kinds of spending restraint that were successful in the 90s are no longer available. That was an era where discretionary spending and a peace dividend got us to a balanced budget. The spending problem now is in the mandatory programs. The discretionary part's been done, and so now the hard work remains. This is a different world.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you very much.